Well, good morning, everybody, and what a fabulous audience. Suddenly, everyone fell silent. But they're still out there. That's really wonderful. My name's Julie Ewington. I'm the head of the Australian Art Department here. It's my enormous privilege and pleasure to be working this morning with Betty Churcher, AO, very, very well-known daughter of Brisbane.
Absolutely.
Citizen of Australia and authority on art, Australian and international. Today we're here to talk about the second of Betty's beautiful notebooks publications. This one with Grace Cossington Smith on the front, her sock knitter painting on the front, is the Australian notebooks published by Migunya Press from the University of Melbourne, and it follows up in the book that was done in 2011 of art more generally. And this is our subject today, this very, very beautiful and very rewarding book. I should just say by way of introduction that this is an artist's book. You can see the lovely rounded covers, and it's got beautiful drawings inside that Betty has made, and it's got a sort of an artist's, to keep it closed. And the subject of the book is Betty's drawings. Betty's drawings, the way she looks, the way she sees, the way she notates, the way she interprets works of art through her drawings. And these ones are drawn from 6 of Australia's major collections, starting here in Brisbane. And then Betty worked her way across the country on a kind of grand tour, working down to Sydney, to Canberra, to Melbourne, to Adelaide, and across to Perth, where, as you know, she was the director of the Art Gallery of Western Australia for 3 very important and very happy years before going on to be the director of the National Gallery of Australia for, I believe, 7 years in Canberra.
7 or 8 years.
Yes, 1990 to 1997, where I did have some contact with the world-renowned Betty Blockbuster. At any rate, what we're going to do now is start, though, with what the book's about, and we're going to start at the first place, and the first place is the Queensland Art Gallery, and the first work that Betty and I want to talk about is a rather famous painting, the very first purchase for our gallery's collection. There were gifts before, but this was the first thing we put our money down for. Blandford Fletcher's Evicted, a really wonderful painting. Yes, there it is. From 1887. And so this allows me to ask Betty, why Blandford Fletcher's Evicted? Is this a painting that's coming back to haunt you?
It does. It's followed me around for the whole of my life, really. Starting when I was 7 years old, my mum and dad brought me in with my brother to the Queensland Gallery, which was very small. In those days was a director and an assistant to the director, and that was it. That was the full staff. And that painting absolutely entranced me. And before I started drawing on this most recent tour of Australia, I had drinks with my brother. And he said, well, you've got to include Evicted. I said, no, Ian, not again. I'm not going to include Evicted. He said, but you've got to include Evicted. That's where it all started. He could remember me nagging my father to take us again and again and again. And Dad's view was, well, we've seen the gallery, why are we going again? But I wanted to see that. And I was in a wheelchair because I knew I was going to have to be on my feet all day. And I was wheeling past, and I looked across to Evicted. I thought, I'll just go in and have a look. And I turned the wheelchair and went in. And in the wheelchair, my eye level was precisely where it would have been when I was 7 years old. And I suddenly saw what it was. It wasn't the story. It wasn't the pathos of the Victorian drama that Blandford Fletcher was painting. What got me was the magic of oil paint, that a stretch of canvas could miraculously be turned into autumn leaves on the ground and the people's feet. And that's what I drew in the book. I didn't draw the whole picture, I just drew what I could see when I was 7 years old. And then, blow me down, the designer of this book, who I must give a great vote of thanks for, because he's done a fabulous job, I think, Hamish Freeman. Hamish goes and gives it a double-page spread. So whether I like it or not, I'm going to go out with Blanford Fletcher.
I think it's important, though. I mean,
there's the feet. That's what I drew.
Drawing, yes, it is important because, don't they say, give me a child before she is 7 and she'll be mine for life?
That's what the Jesuits said.
That's what the Jesuits said. Gender's been changed, of course. But it is true. The early experiences are so important, so formative. I've looked at this painting again, and I know what Betty's saying. We found in this gallery with our children's programs that what the children pick out from the works is not at all what we think is important. That was the most important piece of research that we ever did in the 1990s when we were starting with our Children's Art Centre.
Yeah.
But I've also wondered, and if we can go back to the Blanford Fletcher, I just wondered too whether the gaze of a little girl, it's a wonderful picture, and this little girl, I just wondered, whether you mightn't have thought, she's such a spunky kid.
She's my age, actually.
And she's looking straight at the viewer, and that look says, "Don't you dare pity us." I was saying.
Well, no, that wasn't.
That wasn't
honest,
it. It was the leaves. It was the leaves.
My eyesight didn't go up that far.
Well, it is wonderful, and it is wonderful for us. We've had this painting now for a very long time, and it's much loved. And it's wonderful that you have brought your special magic to it. And that magic is drawing. And I think it's particularly interesting that you choose to draw the works rather than paint copies of them or even copies of fractions of them. So I need to say, why is drawing the thing?
I think one of the things about drawing is that it slows you down. And I think we go through galleries at a bit of a clip sometimes, and we take in the subject matter and on to the next one. If you're drawing, it slows you down and you notice things that you may not have otherwise noticed. The artist John Olsen said to me, he said, "I love your writing." He said, "You shine a torch into dark places." In other words, what he meant was that I focus on aspects of a painting that you may not have noticed when you were looking at the painting as a whole. For instance, Blanford Fletcher, you may not have noticed those autumn leaves and those boots and the contact of those boots on the ground. And drawing does that for me. It fixes it in my memory so that if my eyesight, which is not as brilliant as it could be, if it should go down any further, I've got a whole lot of images fixed forever in my memory bank. And I can close my eyes and I can see them paint stroke by paint stroke almost. And it is important that I did start life as a painter. I think that determines my selection. But the selection actually was based on either the pictures that I thought had been remarkable for the gallery or remarkable for me.
I think it's very fascinating, though. I want to go back to the drawing. I'll just have a tiny digression. Years ago, one of the first times I went to Europe, I watched all these people making copies in the various museums, and I went back to talk to our mutual friend Virginia Spate, the great art historian, and I said, "Virginia, why is it that these people who are evidently quite competent are doing all these copies in the art museums, and what they're producing is so appalling, right? They just don't look like anything." And she said, she's so great, she said, "Oh, that's simple," she said, they're only painting what's on top. because that's all they can see is what's on the top layer of the painting. They don't know how to construct the painting from below.
Well, that's a very astute comment.
Very
yes.
astute point. But with the drawing, I think you're going with the kind of slow art that's your special favourite. You're going to the structure, aren't you?
I'm getting, hopefully, into the... Again, John Olsen, he always says the right thing. He says the engine room. He said you get into the engine room, meaning into the head of the artist to try and see it from his or her point of view. And I think that is important. Virginia is absolutely right.
And so drawing allows you to see to the structure of the painting and the thinking of the artist.
And why did they do that? You know.
Before we pass on from this, there's something else that occurred to me. Of course, you grew up in Brisbane, and we don't have crunchy autumn leaves here. It must have been deeply fascinating. You can practically hear them.
Well, I had a Scots father, and I had a great sort of romantic feeling for the other, you know, over there, the Northern Hemisphere. And so I suppose there was a little bit of that in this too.
Noticing something quite different. Yes, how very fascinating. When you were that old, when you first came at 7 or so, did you always draw then?
Yes, I did. Not other people's paintings, but my own drawings. And I remember I used to make up stories, complicated stories. I wish I'd kept the drawings, but I'd be illustrating them wildly, you know, on those pads that you could just tear a sheet off, and it was almost like animation, you know, and I'd love to see them now. But in my memory, they were so realistic, these people that I was inventing and the stories that I was inventing. So I drew all the time. And the other thing was, it was one of the few things that I could do well. And I thought everybody could draw. I thought it was just a gift that everyone could have. It's rather like some child that has perfect musical pitch. You know, they probably think everybody has perfect pitch. But believe me, I can tell them they don't. I thought everyone could draw. If you could see, you could draw. And it was a slow realisation that no, not everybody can draw. But it's always been with me for as long as I can remember.
Was that realisation developed? I mean, I suppose you must have, obviously you went to art school as a young woman, but was there training of that capacity, or was that something that during your school years you developed by yourself?
Oh, it was just at school, I think, I first discovered that I could draw and that others couldn't, and that I seemed to be able to draw better than most people. I remember one time the drawing, there's no such thing as child art then, and the drawing lesson was the teacher would put up a toy that a child had brought in, and we'd have to draw it. On this occasion it was a toy Mickey Mouse, you know, about that big cloth. And she put this up, and there was a black nose sitting in front of a black face, and we had pastel books and pastel colouring in pencils. And I thought, now how do you draw a black nose in front of a black face? And when I found that if I put a white line around the nose, it leapt out from the face, and it was a real eureka moment for me. I thought, I've done it.
It sounds like quite a tough one to me. But at any rate, later on you did become a trained artist, a trained painter. But you continued to draw, didn't you? You continued always to draw. And did you continue to draw later on when you were looking after the 4 boys? Was it always part of your life?
Yes, to a certain extent. But mainly when I became director of not so much the director of the Art Gallery of Western Australia, because I wasn't organising exhibitions to a great extent there. But when I got to the National Gallery and I would travel, I would draw in order to remember where the work of art was, because sometimes you'd think, now did I see that in Washington or did I see that in Los Angeles? So you draw it to remember it, but also, as I say, to imprint it on my memory, to slow me down enough so that I looked at it intensely. And I used to think, when in the 70s, when performance art was very much a la mode, and people would sit and watch a performance, sometimes for 30, 35 minutes. I think, if only you would sit and watch a painting for 35 minutes, goodness knows what you'd see.
So you drew to explore and to really see. That was the point of it.
And remember.
And to remember.
Yeah.
I know that you said that you don't really normally work with the ephemeral arts like performance, but you do work with works like, this is our Jambalogna, you do work with sculpture and with painting.
Oh, yes.
And to remember what that is actually like. Sculpture is also a subject in your book as well as painting, and this is one of the ones that you've drawn, this Jambalogna.
This is a miraculous one. I don't know if you know the story of this, but this was after I came back from London, this was discovered. And it's 16th century. Jambalogna was one of the leading sculptors of the Medici court. And it was identified, first of all, by this Robert Smith, who was working for the Queensland Gallery. Robert Haynes then had an assistant. Beyond Veronica,
So there were three people now.
Three people now. And it was Robert Smith that discovered this. It had extraordinary history. It had survived 500 years of Europe's volatile history. I was looking into it, and I found a reference to it in a Christie's catalogue in London in about 1894, and it was described as a large wax by Jambalogna in a walnut case with folding doors. And it's sold to, I forget his name, but for about £4.15, I think it was. But that was in 1894. £4.15 was quite a
bit of money.
A sum of money. Anyway, how it got out to Australia, we don't know. Somehow it got out of its case, because it's no longer in its case. And it was brought into the Queensland Museum, not the art gallery, the museum, sometime before 1911, because that's when they started keeping records, and there's no record of it at all. And it had evidently been expelled by a director of the museum who was trying to upgrade his show, his display. And he said, "I'll get that old wax out of here." And so the preparators took it downstairs in that Queensland Museum. That was on Gregory Terrace, the big red brick building. And they shoved it on top of a cupboard where they had tea. Nobody wanted it. And that's where they drank their tea and coffee. And they had a dartboard down there. And I thought, well, luckily a dart didn't land on top of the cupboard. But Bob Smith found it and identified it. The other three, it was part of a bronze panel to Luca Grimaldi, who was one of the leading elite of Genoa in the 16th century. The other three existing, surviving panels are in the V&A Museum in London. And I went to London to look at them. And I think the flagellation is one of the good ones, actually. They're all good, but Jambalogna used to keep his waxes. Often waxes were only kept long enough to support the contract for a bronze casting. If there was any argument about whether there should be 4 figures or 5, they could produce this wax. But he mixed his wax with colophony, which is a resin from Brazil, and that gave it a certain strength to survive. And when you think how it survived on top of a cupboard, unair conditioned for about 50 years, without air conditioning in Brisbane's climate, which fluctuates and wax melts, as you know, but it didn't. It's a miracle of survival, and it shows you how tough works of art can be.
Actually be.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that it's got the Brazilian material, because it shows that he was obviously into the new technologies of the time, because it had only been 100 years that people had been going back and forward to South America and bringing those things back.
Yeah.
I have to say that in my time at the gallery, it has been put into a new case. It is treated as the treasure that it is, and the conservators won't allow us to breathe on it. Not even breathe on it. So I'm very glad that it is such a tough and wonderful thing. But this allows me just to say something else about the drawing. When you're drawing and you're remembering, I'm kind of closing my eyes, you're remembering where your hand was, and you're remembering the relations and you're of things on a painting, and you're remembering how you looked at it. Is that different for sculpture? And with the sculpture and the drawing, do you think it's a different relationship between you, the drawing body, and the sculpture body that you're looking at?
No, I do think, again, John Olsen was shining his torch on dark places, like in that gem Bologna. I don't think I had noticed till I drew it, those little people that had scrambled up a column in order to get a better view of what was going on.
Yes.
Those little human touches. Mm-hmm. You look at Christ in the centrally placed panel, and you look at the subject, but you don't notice these little things.
Can we go back, Michaela, just to yes. So the little people.
Where's the little face?
Up the top, on the left.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So it's really the seeing.
It helps you to see what you wouldn't otherwise see.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. All righty. Betty, we've been very lucky to have a look at the minute. With what we've got in our own collection, but you did actually go to other art galleries and look. You did.
I would like to talk about the Picasso, though, if I may.
Right, okay, let's go
Where
back
is
to...
he?
Where's La Belle Hollandaise, our great star? There she
La
is.
Belle, because that came in...
So we can't leave her.
In 1959, we came back to Australia in 1957. Robert Haynes is the director. And there was this eccentric millionaire, Major Harold de Valruben, and he was eccentric. He'd purchased this picture in 1940, I think for £6,000.
I think you said 6,000 in the book.
£6,000. And he wanted to give his whole collection to the Queensland Gallery, but he wanted to know what it was worth now. He'd purchased it in 1940. Now it's 1959. He wants to know how it's escalated. And he thought, well, the only way to do that is to put it to auction in London. And then he said to Robert, now you've got to bid for it, but your bid has got to be the last bid. He said, I don't care how high it goes. You bid, yours is the last bid. And he said, I'll then walk across and I'll sign a cheque for it. And he did. And when I was researching this, I found in the ABC archives, they've got a clip of the auction, which was a terrific surprise, because there's the auctioneer, very, very English, and he's standing there with his gavel and he's saying, at £55,000, do I have any advance on £55,000? No, then sold to the Queen's. And he looks again, he says, Queensland Gallery? He'd obviously never heard of Queensland. It's a treasure. I hope they keep it as a treasure of their archives. And Robert Haynes has to be congratulated for convincing the government to allow him to bid for money that he didn't have. The Agent General did the bidding, and he was given the same instructions. Yours has got to be the last bid. And as far as Major Harold de Valruben was concerned, the higher it went, the better, because he wrote the cheque, but then, of course, he got the money back. But that's how it came into the collection.
I don't know if we'd be allowed to do that now. And when you said eccentric, you're absolutely right. What an astonishing procedure. I bet the auctioneers were happy.
Oh, probably, yes, of course, because it was the buyer's premium and this.
And still we have the finest Picasso in Australia.
Well, it's a very important one.
It is.
Really important one in Picasso's whole career, because it marks a change from his blue period, which was all symbolism and I think I say mood and melancholy in the book, to these sort of more robust figures, which really went right through his life. It's written on the top to my friend Paco Durio. Now, Durio was a Basque friend of Picasso's who occupied the studio in the Bateau Lavoie, where Picasso later had a studio. And when he gave this picture to Paco Durio, he made this curious remark. He said, "The best breasts are those that give the most milk." And there's been all this speculation. Was she a nursing mother, perhaps? Perhaps she was feeding a baby. Richardson, who has written the great biography of Picasso, and probably will die before he finishes it, but his theory is that, and I think he's probably right, that Picasso was teasing his Paris lover, Fernande Olivier, because she had little neat breasts, and there was these great big breasts of the Dutch girl.
And you say in the book too that she's this big, healthy, bonny girl, not one of these kind of skinny, alcohol-fueled Parisians. Healthy girl. So we're very, very fortunate to have her.
Very lucky.
Yeah, I do know some people who say that she's the most beautiful girl they've ever seen, but I think we have to...
He says that.
Yeah.
Major Harold de Valrubens.
Yeah, that's right. He said
there's another clip of him being
the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen.
Yeah.
Is it time we should move on to another collection?
Please, let's.
Okay, and I'd like to ask you, you have a wonderful story in the book, and I just have to interject to say, Betty talks about drawing, but what she also does is that she writes, and it is the most wonderful read.
Good.
It's
Thank you,
a
Julie.
ripping set of yarns.
That's what it is.
And with wonderful accounts and wonderful stories that just bring the pictures alive. So there's two things happening. The artist in you is drawing, and the writer in you is writing these gorgeous tales. And you've got a beauty about the great Cleopatra's Banquet by Tiepolo in the National Gallery of Victoria. And I wonder if we can visit that.
Yes.
Because that's one of the great paintings in Australia.
And that also has an interesting history. And I think I'm a bit of a gossip, and I think that sharing gossip can often direct you to look back with curiosity at the picture itself. And that's why I do it, just to bring it to life. Now that Tiepolo, I don't know whether we can find it, the Banquet of Cleopatra, had an
this is not much good, but it's that great big painting.
extraordinary history. It was sold actually out of Tiepolo's studio in 1744. And Tiepolo was probably the most popular Venetian painter, or popular painter in the 18th century, because theatre in the 18th century was the paramount art, and he is a theatrical painter. This story of Cleopatra comes from Pliny's natural history in the 1st century AD. And it's a story of how Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, challenged Mark Antony, the triumvir of Rome, that she could produce a feast more lavish and more costly than anything that Rome could do. And of course, Mark Antony thought, rubbish. Egypt can't do anything that Rome can't do. So they have this wonderful feast, and it's on that lovely open loggia in the palace of the Queen of Egypt. And at the end of the feast, she removes from her ear this pearl, which They were the largest and most valuable pearls in Christendom. And she just drops it into a glass of wine, which, so the story goes, dissolved the pearls. She drinks it down. And she has now drunk the most expensive glass of wine. Now, Professor J.D. Anderson's written a great book on this, and she looked into it and had chemists pass an opinion, could a glass of wine dissolve a pearl? And they said, no, I don't think so. I don't think even a glass of vinegar would do it. It would soften it, but not dissolve it. But how it came to Melbourne, again in a tortuous way, Joseph Stalin, in January 1931, I can easily remember the date because it's the year I was born, the month I was born. Joseph Stalin was starting his first 5-year plan and he wanted some ready cash. So he started selling the crown jewels. One of the biggest and most avid buyers was Andrew Mellon. So a lot of the Hermitage's collection has ended up in the National Gallery in Washington. It must be very irksome for the director of the Hermitage, I have to say. But he sent Cleopatra's feast to London with a price tag of £30,000. Now, £30,000 in 1931 was a king's ransom. And the board of the National Gallery London prevaricated. It's an argument against acquisition by committee. The Foreign Office was saying, mumbling and grumbling, well, I don't know whether, you should be sort of helping the Bolsheviks in this way, with ready cash. And the Bolsheviks had this extraordinary coda to the sale. It had to be in notes of small denomination. And it had to be carried across to them, the agents, in London. For over 2 years, they argued. And the Russian agents thought, well, forget it. And they offered it to the agent for the Felton Bequest, who was in London. And he could remember that he had to carry across Trafalgar Square this huge suitcase full of small denomination notes, which came here. They offered it for $32,000 to Melbourne. And Melbourne, because of the Felton Bequest, could act quickly and say yes. And it was a great purchase for the National Gallery of Victoria. Sir Kenneth Clark had been the director-elect at the National Gallery when all of this was going on, and he, of course, is gnashing his teeth in the background, not able to do anything about it. And 6 years later, 1939, he was still fuming. He's saying it is the most absurd and disgusting thing that the National Gallery has ever done to let that picture go. He felt it should have been in the National Gallery London. I think it should be in the National Gallery of Victoria.
Well, it's certainly, the National Gallery of Victoria has the greatest collection of European art in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
I think we can say that without any shadow of a doubt, yeah?
Yeah.
The greatest collection, and the Tiepolo Cleopatra's Banquet is absolutely a centrepiece of it.
Yeah.
We're going to go to questions pretty shortly, but there is one more fabulous story which we have to pull out from the collection of the Art Gallery of Western Australia, and we can't show you the picture, but I know that as far as art gossip and art knowledge goes, the story of the great Stanley Spencer Christ in the Wilderness picture that's in Perth, a picture that you looked after and loved. That just about takes the biscuit, and I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about it, because if you go to Perth, you really must go and see what's in the collection of the Art Gallery of Western Australia. It's a terrific collection.
Yeah, Tony Bond was responsible for the purchase of that. He was assistant director at the time. And Stanley Spencer was a man of extraordinary naivety. He'd married this Hilda Carline and had 2 daughters. And then I think it was about 1939, or it might be just before the war broke out in August 39. Anyway, it was around about that time, the outbreak of the Second World War. He met this, she could only be described as a sort of a blonde flapper from London, Patricia Preece. She'd come up from London to settle in Cookham, which is a village just north of London, but it's difficult to get to. I had to change trains to get to Cookham. And Patricia Preece was putting it out that she was an artist. She wasn't, in fact, an artist. She had a life partner in, I'm not going to remember her name.
Dorothy Hepworth.
What was her name?
Dorothy Hepworth.
Dorothy Hepworth.
Not Barbara, Dorothy.
Dorothy, yeah, that's why I could remember it. I don't think Stanley Spencer had ever heard of lesbianism. Like Queen Victoria wouldn't have agreed that it could happen.
That's right.
And Patricia Preece was vicious. She moved into the Spencer household, and Stanley just fell for her, absolutely fell a bundle. And anything she wanted, he would give her. First of all, she took charge of the family finances, very cunningly. Then she insisted on expensive gifts. She made him almost bankrupt with the gifts that she demanded. Then she made him hand over the deed of his beautiful house, which I've seen. I went to it. It's Linfield. It's in right central Cookham. It's just back from the high street. It was a 7-bedroom, big, grand house, and she had it made over in her name. Hilda Carline, by this time, has been initiated divorce proceedings, as one would imagine. And the divorce comes through, and at last he can marry his loved one. She would never let him consummate the marriage in any way. She posed for him. You may know the paintings. They're in the Tate Gallery, in the nude, you know, these most sort of lascivious pictures, you know, this Stanley Spencer drooling over this sort of naked blonde. Then they got married, and then he began to think, because the honeymoon was to be in Cornwall, and at last he was going to have this consummation of this marriage. To his horror, he found that Patricia Preece had rented 2 cottages, one for Dorothy and Patricia, and one for Stanley. And then he began to realise, Patricia Preece, the next thing she did was to rent this beautiful house out so that she and Dorothy could have income, you know, settled income. And he was told to go into the garden shed at the back. So poor Stanley fled. He went down to London. He got a room in Swiss Cottage. He couldn't paint big pictures because he didn't have a studio, but he thought, well, I can paint these little square panels for the chapel in Cookham. Now, the chapel in Cookham is now a really little museum to Stanley Spencer. It's very touching, actually, but it's got a sort of panelled ceiling, and he was going to paint 40 panels for the 40 days of Lent. Now, in the event, he didn't. He only painted 8.5 panels. And they're Christ in the Wilderness. They're wonderful paintings. That's one. And they're mostly taken from Matthew. And that's the foxes have the den and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath nowhere to lay his head. And, of course, he's thinking of his beautiful house, Lindwood in Cookham, where he's been expelled. And the other one is the eagles. Eagles. And there's Christ again in that voluminous white robe, almost filling the square, and the eagles are tearing at this carcass on the ground, and it's almost thinking of himself being stripped of everything that he ever owned. He did actually get back to Cookham just at the end of his life. Somebody, not into Linwood, he never got that back, but someone managed to buy a friend his childhood house, the one that he was born and bred in. And he went back there and he died. He died in his 60s. So it's a sad story, really. But
he was a spectacular draftsman.
He was extraordinary.
His work as a student even was just indescribably wonderful.
Yes, he was at the Slade.
Yes. But I should just say that there is an interior of that house in a beautiful painting that we have. The interior of Cookham is on display at the Queensland Art Gallery.
And that's Linwood, is it?
That's right.
Yes.
It's a 1937 painting.
Oh, yeah.
So it's the interior of his beautiful house, just
he
the
lost.
mirror, just a little bit of it, the flowers, and you can go and have a look at it because Spencer's not a huge name these days, but he was huge then. And he's still a very much admired artist. And I was kind of thrilled to see that you drew and analysed and wrote and talked about poor old Stanley. What a piece of, what a tragedy. So, the world's most innocent man.
Well, Queen Victoria wouldn't have it that there was such a thing as lesbianism, would she?
Very religious man, but very, very innocent.
Yes.
Perhaps this is the time, I know people have a lot of questions, perhaps this is the time where we could take questions from the audience.
Yeah.
We have 2 roving mics.
Or comments, if you want to make comments.
Contributions. We've got Anita up the back in the blue skirt, and we've got Michaela down here in the floral skirt with roving mics. So if people can just fling their hands into the air and let's have questions for Betty and comments. Anyone want to start? Down here. Yes, thank you. There we are.
This is for you, Betty. In the Architectural Digest many years ago, I have no idea who wrote it. There was a comment by either an artist or an architect who said, apropos I don't know what, I cannot afford the space or the money to have
Cannot afford
the space or the money for an art gallery. So I have an art gallery in my mind. So that's you.
That's a lovely comment. Yes. I have a terrific gallery in my head, yes.
Okay, who else? Oh, down here on the lady in the blonde hair and the
Because
green
we're
and white
blinded. I'm not too good anyway.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your last book, Betty, which I enjoyed enormously. And it's been very revealing, the comments you've made about drawing in that book and this morning. And I identify as an artist and a teacher of drawing very much with them. In relation to that, I just wanted to ask if you had any comments to make about education in drawing these days.
About what?
Education, the instruction of drawing in the art world today.
Yes, well, it's changed so. See, I'm moving through my 80s now, and so when I was drawing my Mickey Mouse, that was in the 30s. So things have, changed a lot. I think probably for the better, on the whole. I think if, I sometimes think with my grandchildren, their little thumbs are going the whole time and images are flashing. And I think, slow down. And if we could just slow down. I went to that lovely exhibition of Falling to Earth. I don't know whether you've seen that, isn't it? Stunning. And there were some drawings made there. And I think that's the sort of thing that, I think is a good thing, because the people who made that drawing had to slow down for a little while they made the drawing. And I think to copy has no value in itself. It's only of value to the person or to an audience that might look at a drawing and think, I've never noticed that. And a couple of artists have said that, especially like for Streeton's drawing of Fires On. You don't notice those little people hurrying down the hill. Well, they're the ones I drew. I didn't draw the main picture at all. I just drew the sort of the side effect.
So drawing's a way of taking note.
Yes, and the research that you do in connection with it. Another one?
And there's another lady in the middle down here.
Betty,
Excuse me, can you hold it right up to your mouth?
I can.
Marvellous.
Oh, that's better.
Nicolaides Kimon, you used his book, here.
Just, yeah.
You used his instruction when you were teaching in the 1950s, is that right? Can you comment a little bit on his style of instruction?
Who was this?
Nicolaides Kimon, The Natural Way to Draw. Do you remember that book? It was a text. It was a text that evidently released artists in Brisbane from the real, getting things right.
I remember it, but I can't remember it with any precision.
Okay.
I'm sorry, what was the gist of The Natural Way to Draw? It was...
It was a series of... it was a book, but divided into a series of exercises where you spent 3 hours drawing, but it introduced contour drawing and, like half an hour of drawing.
That's
and you had to do it in...
And John Malvic used that a lot, I remember.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
And Richard Rodier Rivron.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Rodier Rivron. I went to Rodier Rivron.
There's a blast from the past.
There's a blast from the past, yes.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for that, because you've just given us something about Malvic that I didn't know, and that's really important.
Yeah.
But then, of course, Betty wrote the book on Malvic, so...
And I did a Malvic from this collection, the Twilight of Women,
yeah.
and that's the one that got edited out. I don't know why. Poor old Malvic.
Poor old, what a great painter.
Yeah.
And
right.
what an amazing effect on drawing he had in
Yes.
Brisbane.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, in the other gallery, Transparent, the watercolour exhibition, some fantastic works by his student, Joy Roggenkamp.
Oh.
Big, bold things, as he encouraged people to be big and bold. Are there any... Oh, Joanna up in the middle. And who's next after Joanna? Any more comments or questions out there?
Thank you very much. It's not on?
Yes, it is. Just hold it right up to your mouth, Joanna, like a rock star.
Betty, I would like to ask you, do you always draw from the original painting? And how long approximately would you take to do your drawings and notations?
Yes, an interesting thing that I discovered was that I cannot draw from a reproduction. I really can't. I've got to be standing in front of the work, and I've got to be emotionally and, physically involved with what I'm doing. And as for the time it takes, I don't know, I have no idea, because when it works, I just sort of dive into it. That little Degas bronze of a dancer that's in this collection, where she's looking at the sole of her right foot, I was drawing that, and it just completely, I just went into another world while I was drawing. So I have no idea how long. It could have been half an hour, it could have been 10 minutes, I don't know how long it took. But it was as if I had that little dancer in front of me. That's a beautiful, beautiful bronze that you have in this collection. I've seen other bronzes, and they've muffed the arm that she's holding out here to balance. This bronze, this cast, is a perfect one. You're really lucky, or astute, to have it.
We're lucky. It was a gift from Philip Bacon 2 years ago in memory of Margaret Olley. We were lucky.
Yeah.
Well, we were blessed. Yeah, they are wonderful things full of energy, aren't they?
Oh, magical.
That's what I was asking before. Do you feel it in your body as well as kind of remember it with your eye and your hand? Yeah. Drawing sculpture, I think, is rather special too.
Yes.
Now, are there any last comments or queries for Betty? This is our chance to ask her about the life of drawing and the life of the mind. Any last questions? I've got one of my own, if I can. It's a ridiculous question. It's an impossible question. Did you have a favourite in this book? Did you have a favourite? Is there one where you felt you learned more or had an insight that was very special?
I think the little Degas, I suddenly got on to Degas. I felt as if I was Degas for a minute, which was wonderful.
That would be a very complicated experience.
Yes. That's John Olsen, getting into the engine room, where it's all happening, not the end result, but the process by which it's made. And so that, for me, was a magical experience. I didn't expect it to happen. I was just walking past it and I thought, oh, that's nice, I'll draw that. And it just sort of took me off. Julia.
And you say in the that's in the introduction, and you say that he didn't expect them to be cast. He made them out of clay as notations himself, in fact. So they were very much working projects, these little things, for him.
His way of drawing.
His way of drawing, in fact. So it kind of makes sense to me that I didn't know that you were going to give that answer, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
In terms of how your project goes.
These are a great favourite of mine.
Yes, well, they're a great favourite of mine too. These are the notorious sardine cans of Fiona Hall, which this is a group that's in the National Gallery of Australia collection, the Paradisus terrestris.
Yes, they came in my first year as director, and she's a marvellous artist.
If you don't know them, I do recommend you startle yourself by looking in the book and seeing what they actually have.
What it was with, I asked her, about that, because she rolls, it's the old sardine cans that some of you will remember, where there was a key and you rolled it back. And they started to go out, with new packaging. And about in 1990, 91, we were all asked to keep our sardine cans. But it was almost too late, they'd almost finished. But she's very much about the preservation of this wonderful planet on which we live, and she really is distressed to see how this thing called progress just mows across, the land and destroys things. And she was fascinated with the things that the 18th century seamen brought back from the South Seas, because here they'd found a new Eden, despoiled, underutilised, as yet. No longer, but for a while it was. And all of these plants that she uses are specimens that were brought back. And she looked at a whole lot of florilegiums and catalogues of botany, and she noticed that a lot of them categorised plants by means of their method of reproduction, like the banana plant, etc. So she thought she'd put inside the way we reproduce, our method of reproduction. So you'll see against this grass tree with its pollinating spike here, there's an erect penis, And here this is bananas, there's a non-erect penis. This is the grapefruit. You see, they're all subtropical things that the Northern Hemisphere in the 18th century hadn't yet heard of. And so Fiona's making a comment about that we're spoiling the things that we really should be treasuring. And she's a very slow, dedicated worker, and she did these she moved from Sydney to Adelaide, she'd made these on a kitchen table. And
She used to actually knit aluminium during plane journeys until there came a moment when one wasn't allowed to take knitting needles, let alone aluminium, onto planes. But that's another story. It is a great work, I think, to have it for the National Gallery collection. Lucky you. Yeah.
And then later on, we were doing a
garden.
Well, we put an extension on for our major exhibitions, and it made a little enclosed garden. And she did this magical garden. And there was a tragedy that happened where a family that lives, one of the original families in the Canberra region, the Davies, they had a light aircraft. They had quite a big property. And she had 5 children. Twins went up in this light aircraft, and there must have been a sort of air pocket or something, because the plane came down and she lost both the twins. And it was just as Fiona was making this garden, and she got very distressed because so many people were sending flowers. She said it was almost like a funeral parlour. So she asked them to send money to the gallery instead. So I asked Fiona, I gave the money to Fiona to make the garden a little bit more, and she put the twins' names, Tamsin and Duca, onto the seats in this garden, and it's just a lovely tribute to these beautiful young people. I think they're about 21 or 22.
Dreadful.
And so Fiona's done a lot for the National Gallery, I have to say.
Yes, she is quite something. I can tell you from personal acquaintance, she's quite something.
Yeah.
Now, are there any final questions? Oh, down the front, here we are. Michaela, down the front, please. Can someone, right down here. Sorry, down the front, in the front row. Lady in the yellow dress. And that will be our last, I think.
Yes, I have a question listening to you, which has been fascinating. I'm wondering, how do you see drawing in the relationship with the conceptual art that is becoming so big today? And I'm not saying that, how do I say this? I think there are a lot of very serious artists doing conceptual art, and they actually also know the basics, because to me, art is to be able to actually draw and see and have that, because I mean, all the old masters, they could do that. They were just fantastic draftsmen, and then they developed, and the genius was the extra 10%. Sometimes today it feels like, yes, what we see in museums, to me personally, I can't see a lot of that staying for posterity, because there is very little involvement of the person, of the artist in the, no, not in the creation of the thing, because he has created it, but how, I don't really know how to put it.
I think I know where you're getting at. And I find with a lot of conceptual stuff, it swoops into your imagination, and it beguiles you, but it swoops out again. And I don't want to return to it. Now, that's just me, because I'm a painter monkey. But I think that some of the art, like Tracy Emin's bed, that you've probably heard of, that was created such a stir, I think, in 1999, in the Turner Prize at the Tate Gallery in London, which was this bed in which she'd lived and discarded her underclothes and all sorts of gunk. That really doesn't interest me. I don't even want to see it, let alone go back to see it. But sort of the Chapman brothers are a different matter, it just depends, I think. I did try with Donald Judd's bricks. I looked at it. And I don't want to go back and look at it again, though. But I do want to go back and look at a lot of these things, and I do want to go back and... But that's a personal thing, you know. I think some people... it depends on your... I know precisely... I'm in tune with you, I have to say. But I can see, you know, when I look at my grandchildren, that they may be more in tune with images that flash on and off, you know, but that's what they've been brought up to. I've been brought up to something else. I find there's something very comforting about to be able to look at a work of art and know that it's been in this world for 100 years or maybe even 300 years, and it's likely to be here for another 300 years. That thing of continuation and permanence I find personally very attractive. And a lot of things, you know, they're just, you know, they can't last, you know, they're thrown together and they're not meant to last. But again, I don't want to pass judgment because I think my granddaughter may have a different
view.
A different view.
One thing that does last is a book, though.
Oh, and I must, if I may, give a vote of thanks to the designer. I think he's done a magical job. He's turned it into like the sketchbook. I sent the sketchbooks that I'd used down, and they were just like that. So he's made it as a sketchbook.
It's absolutely beautiful.
And it's a lovely, lovely design. And everything he does, I've agreed with. Look, fancy to do that. The end papers to reverse out one of my drawings. Who'd ever have thought of that? I'd never have thought of that in a million years.
Well, I find agreeing with designers very, very kind of rewarding. I have
His
to
name
say.
is Hamish Freeman. God love him. I've never met him.
Inside this beautiful book are not only Hamish Freeman's wonderful design, but Betty's insights. And I think what also survives when things change are the contributions that individuals make, that you have made to our understanding of these works. And that will endure, that will last, and that adds to the stories.
Yeah.
You know, so all of these stories have gathered more because Betty has drawn and looked and written. It's truly a lovely, lovely book, and thank you very much for speaking to us today about it. Would you please join me in thanking